Hey folks, welcome back for another build video where we are looking at pairing the Catharsis Exotic Mask with an LMG focused build. So I'm kind of viewing this as a spiritual successor to the weapon handling build that we did previously. I'll link that in the video description below, but just know that is one of the focuses of this build, is kind of carrying that whole weapon handling focused idea through this build, and now including the addition of the Catharsis Exotic Mask. In particular, using the Catharsis instead of Sawyer's knee pads. So do me a favor, just keep that in the back of your head. With this build, on top of pairing Catharsis with the LMG, we're also looking at utilizing weapon handling with the LMG as well. And one particular reason I think the Catharsis Mask pairs particularly well with an LMG style of play is the Vicious Cycle talent, where taking damage builds stacks to a cap of 30, and each stack grants 1% weapon damage. So every time you take damage, you actually increase your own weapon damage as well. Which in this case is really turning a negative into a positive, because one of the downsides of an LMG build is that in order to have sustained fire and take full advantage of the extended mag that a lot of LMGs have, you have to have your head out of cover, which means you're gonna take damage during an encounter, because even though you could be focusing on one enemy and suppressing them, there's very often going to be another enemy or group of enemies that are going to be able to fire on you. But with the Catharsis Mask, now you can be taking damage, but at least increasing your weapon damage, and on top of that, you're building stacks towards that cap of 30, at which point, once you tip over that cap, you're going to remove all your stacks and any status effect that you happen to have and drop a healing cloud around you, which restores 5% of max armor for 10 seconds to all allies in range. So to that point, this build can work solo or in a group. And actually, if you're in a group, this might be easier to put together, because some of those Langmo cores that you can see re-rolled down there, you could actually leave as armor cores to give a greater benefit to your allies whenever you drop a healing cloud. Let's start off here with the specialization. We've gone with Gunner for a number of different reasons. In particular, you have the Coupler talent, in which every third reload is 50% faster. The Incessant talent, which is always a great one. 10% armor on kill is never a bad thing to have. And then the last one I'll specifically mention is the Emplacement talent, because even though this build is far more mobile without the Sawyer's knee pads, with the Emplacement talent, you do still get a benefit for remaining motionless for at least 1 second, so that is something to keep in mind whenever you're in an encounter. If you can stay motionless, that extra 10% weapon handling is also a nice thing to have. For our primary weapon, we've talked about it a bit. The LMG, in this case, the Iron Lung. Just from a damage output standpoint, it's a really great one to have now that it's out there. But honestly, there are a number of different LMGs you could plug into this primary weapon slot. It's just that we've gone with the Iron Lung to showcase it a little bit, and also talk about its Ardent talent. Shooting heats up the weapon, filling a heat meter. The meter is equivalent to 50% of the weapon's standard mag size. And when the meter is full, rounds shot by the weapon ignite enemies. And when you're not shooting, the meter depletes over time. Reloading or swapping the weapon fully depletes the meter. So really the way to read this is that the back half of your magazine is going to have ignited rounds. I will confess I have not fully investigated the ignite status effect on these bullets as to whether they're affected by status effect attributes. It's not something we're focusing on for this build, so it's something we might get into later. Feel free to sound off in the comments below if you have any additional information on that. Otherwise, we'll leave that as it is, because for this particular build, the main reason for choosing the Iron Lung is actually its standard weapon damage output and not the talent in particular. The talent in this case is just a nice icing on the cake. Again, the back half of your mag is going to ignite enemies. On top of that, we have damage to target out of cover in that secondary core attribute slot, as it is the native role on LMGs. And then for the third attribute here, we've actually gone for damage to armor, since we already have damage to target out of cover natively in that secondary core attribute slot. For our secondary weapon here, we've gone with an M870 variant, and this is specifically to deal with those rushers that might get up close and personal with you. But realistically, you're not going to be using your secondary weapon all that often. The primary weapon is the one we're going to focus on here. So if you have another preference for this slot, feel free to run it instead. One that came to mind, and one we tried out during testing, was the classic M1A. It's just a harder hitting, but still longer range weapon for your secondary if you want to pair your LMG with something harder hitting like that kind of rifle. It can work really well to finish off enemies after you've run out of your mag but don't want to reload on your LMG. And for our sidearm, we've gone with our classic TDI card custom high-end pistol. The +1 skill tier secondary core attribute down there is the real thing we're focusing on. Realistically, you're only pulling this out if you need to buff your skills for any particular reason, so that's why we've gone with this sidearm in particular. But if you have, again, a different preference in this particular slot, we've got no argument with it here. For a mask, we have the aforementioned Catharsis, core attribute of armor, secondary attributes of incoming repairs and armor regen. And in the mod slot here, we've gone for headshot damage. I want to touch on that really briefly here. So because we've decided to use some secondary attributes here for weapon handling, which means building into your standard crit hit chance and crit hit damage isn't nearly as effective as it normally would be. So instead we've gone with weapon handling and headshot damage wherever we can get it, because the weapon handling, again, particularly benefits LMGs because of the high reload time that it helps reduce. But now on top of that, because you've built into weapon handling and particularly buffed the weapon stability, headshots are a lot easier to come by than they ordinarily would be with an LMG. So headshot damage mods are what we've personally gone with here. But with that being said, let's get into our backpack. We have the backbone here. It is the named Langmo backpack. As you can see on this build, we have 3 pieces of Langmo, getting us to that 3-piece bonus of plus 30% LMG damage. And on top of that, of course, we have the perfectly unstoppable force talent. Killing an enemy increases total weapon damage by 7% for 15 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. And grenade kills here add 2 stack. So you're probably not going to get a lot of grenade kills with the Riot Foam grenade. But the perfect version of this talent does have an increase of 2% over the standard version of Unstoppable Force. So that's one of the reasons we've gone with the named backpack here. The other is that, somewhat ironically, I find the named versions of items to be easier to farm for, because as long as they benefit a build, a named item very often is going to come with a fixed talent. In this case, Perfectly Unstoppable Force will always drop with a backbone backpack. And for gear pieces where you're looking to reroll the core attribute, it can be really helpful to not have to worry about what talent gets rolled onto it. So as you can see down there, natively we got armor regen and weapon handling, and then in the mod slot we've gone with headshot damage, which then allowed us to reroll the core attribute to weapon damage. And while ideally we would have both headshot damage and weapon handling in those secondary attribute slots, a little bit of armor regen honestly isn't the worst thing to have on a build where you've mainly focused on stacking weapon damage cores, because that fixed amount of armor regen is much more impactful on a weapon core build than it is on an armor core build. For our chest piece, we've gone with another named item here. It is the Vedmestia Vest, which is the named item from the Petrov Defense Group. And of course, that first brand bonus there gets us plus 10% LMG damage, which comes natively with weapon damage core, meaning we were free to reroll that secondary attribute to headshot damage. And then of course we have headshot damage again here in the mod slot. For anyone who doesn't know, this gear piece is unlocked during the Gunner Field Research, and it is a craftable item, meaning you can spend as many materials as your heart desires trying to get a perfect piece here, but they will all come with the perfect braced talent. While in cover, weapon handling is increased by 50%, so that's a 10% increase on the normal variant, and it comes at no real additional cost because it works really well with an LMG build. Obviously, that 1-piece brand bonus being LMG damage, and that second brand bonus being provided by our Contractor's Gloves, giving us plus 15% weapon handling, which again is something that really benefits an LMG build. The other reason, of course, to go with Contractor's Gloves is that unique 8% damage to armor attribute. On top of that, we've rolled the other secondary attribute slot to headshot damage here again. If you're playing with this build and you find it a little bit unwieldy, or if you decide to go with an LMG that has less native stability on it, in particular the Black Friday comes to mind. If you have the Perfectly Unhinged talent running there and you want some additional weapon handling, this is a place where you could go with weapon handling instead of headshot damage in that second secondary attribute slot. Largely a preferential pick based on how many headshots you think you're going to be getting during an encounter, whether you go with weapon handling or headshot damage here. For knee pads, we have our second piece of Langmo gear and our second piece where we've re-rolled native core attribute from armor to weapon damage, and that is again to increase the overall damage that our LMG can provide. And of course here we get the 2-piece bonus of skill health, which really isn't doing much for us but gets us one step further along our path to getting that 30% LMG damage, which is really the main prize here for stacking all 3 Langmo pieces. On top of that, again, because we had to reroll the core attribute, we were stuck with the secondary attributes that we got, which in this case were armor regen and weapon handling. Again, if you have the time to farm and you really want to maximize your damage output, I would recommend going with headshot damage and weapon handling. But as you'll see in the video later, this combination of attributes, even though it's not perfect, is still more than enough to provide quite a bit of weapon damage. Last but not least, we have our knee pads, which is our third and final piece of Langmo, giving us that plus 30% LMG damage brand bonus. And again, here, as with all 3 pieces of Langmo, we rerolled the core attribute to weapon damage, and we are stuck again with whatever native secondary attributes we got, in this case, armor regen and headshot damage. So as you can see, a smattering of armor regen, headshot damage, and weapon handling throughout this build. I'll restate it one last time. Obviously, if you want to maximize your weapon damage, you want to get pieces that roll with weapon handling and headshot damage natively. But ultimately, as long as you can get a combination of weapon handling and headshot damage, I honestly find this to be more than usable in most situations. And then one final note here, like I mentioned off the top. And then last here we have our skills. For our first skill, we've gone with the Stinger Hive. I think it's a really great pairing with an LMG build. You can set it down next to you while you're firing. It really gives you an early warning system if you do have any rushers that get too close. But alternatively, if you want a different hive, either the Reviver Hive or the Restorer Hive are also good options to go with here. If you're running in a group, the Reviver Hive can be great to pair with that TDI card custom. You can swap to that sidearm, get an additional charge for your Reviver Hive, and then toss it out to any ally that is downed in the field. Or with the Restorer Hive, if you find that you don't have enough armor on this build and you don't want to sacrifice any weapon damage, that can be a great way to get your own armor back during an encounter. But then for our secondary skill here, we've gone with the Banshee Pulse. Anytime you go with the Gunner Specialization, this skill is in contention to be used. It's just a great way to provide disoriented status to any enemies within the cone of affected area. And it really is just a great weapon to use on any enemy, from a rusher to a hunter. It really is a great way to either buy yourself time to get away or give yourself an extra few seconds to apply more weapon damage to a target. In any event, no matter what skills you go with, I hope you put this build together and take it for a spin, particularly if you're an LMG lover or just someone who likes to engage from the back of the battlefield. This is a great build to put together and take advantage of both the Catharsis's healing and weapon damage increasing abilities. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please like the video if you liked it, subscribe if you want to see more stuff like this, and tell your friends about the channel so you can continue to help us grow and make content like this. As long as you guys continue to do that, we will continue to do this, and I will see you in the next one.